Thank you. I'm always very proud of how mature and poised you are during the school day and during our assemblies. And I appreciate, again, everybody's attention today. I'd like to thank, again, good morning. I'd like to thank the following individuals for their assistance with our assembly today. Leah Dukes, Education Director, and Justin Goloski, intern from the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center in Elkins Park, PA. Our parents, Mrs. Beth Schwartzman and Mrs. Joy Bank, who raised our awareness of the ability to have a speaker here today. Mrs. Weitzman, school counselor and supervisor of the Jewish Affinity Group at the middle school. Students are with us today. Mrs. Spohl and the students in the Spartan Culture Club, who delivered a powerful lesson to give you some background with staff titled Personal Identity Through the Lens of the Holocaust, What Rights Are the Most Important to Me. That was yesterday. Our school counselor, Mrs. McDonald, who's been instrumental with arranging the assembly today, meeting with our Jewish Affinity Group, and has helped with the many details. Our tech department, Mr. Wexler, Mr. Coughlin are here helping out. Rabbi Roni Handler from Beth Tikva B'nai Jeshurun, thank you, who will close our assembly today. Dr. Lutz, Director of Student Services, with helping with our affinity groups and spearheading our district's equity plan, our wonderful and supportive school district leadership, Dr. Yannicone and Dr. Johnston, all of our staff, particularly in social studies and English language, who teach the history and literature of the Holocaust, reminding us all to never forget. And finally, all the students in our Jewish Affinity Group and their efforts with our assembly today, hosting the mini Seder and reading books about Jewish culture to our second grade students, and a special shout out to many of our families here from the community. Can I please have a round of applause for this great team? And now we'll turn the microphone over to Zane and Ari. During the assembly, it's not the assembly where you're clapping in between individuals unless I'm telling you to do that, okay? And you're always great doing that, but just kind of follow my lead, particularly during the presentation. So, gentlemen.
Good morning. My name is Zane Kolodner, and this is Ari Schwartzman, and we're here from the STHS Jewish Affinity Group, a group of mostly Jewish students whose goal is to combat anti-Semitism and bigotry in Springfield via education. Before we begin, please be sure to follow these 3 rules. Stay quietly in your seat, be respectful of your peers and of Mr. Stern, and understand that this is a serious topic and not one which should be taken lightly. Anti-Semitism throughout the world has been on the rise over the past few years. Springfield is no exception. Anti-Semitism is belief or behavior of Jews inferiority of Jews, or political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudiced or stereotyped views about Jews.
This speaker and yesterday's No Place for Hate discussions are a part of our district-wide equity plan and a commitment to talking about and pushing back against anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, which have become all too common. Our speaker, Mr. Peter Stern, was born in Nuremberg, Germany in March 1936. In 1941, his family was deported from Germany to a holding camp in Latvia, and then in the spring of 1942, they were transferred into the Riga ghetto. He spent the next 3 years transferring between holding camps, work camps, and the Riga ghetto. He was then transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and then, in the face of an Allied advance, moved to Bergen-Belsen and was liberated there by the British on April 15, 1945. Without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Mr. Peter Stern.
Thank you. Before I start, I will try to finish talking so you will have time to ask me questions. But I will ask you the question I would like to get from you. The answer is, why is it that people like myself, survivors, not only of the Holocaust, but survivors, will come and speak to people like you? What is it that we want? What is it that we want you to do? So, let me start. What you see up here is my family, my father, the guy on top. I'm the guy in the admiral's uniform, and my brother is next to me. My name is Peter Günther Stern, and I was born in Nuremberg and given a Germanic name. My brother, who was born 3 years later in 1939, he's named Samuel. And that was because of the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws were laws not just for the city, but for the entire state of Germany, which basically deprived Jews of their citizenship. The laws were such that if you were a doctor, you could no longer practice in a hospital. Lawyers could no longer practice in court. Teachers could not teach in the public schools. Children, Jewish children, could no longer go to the public schools. In other words, all privileges were denied. One of the laws was that all Jewish children had to have Jewish names. This law was passed in 1935. I was born in 36. The reason my parents, no one else knew about this, was because they didn't publicize that law. Because the Olympics of 1936 were going to be held, excuse me, in Berlin, and they didn't want the bad PR. The laws were established after that. So for my brother, my parents had the choice of Abraham, Moses, Israel, Samuel. He and I have basically decided that they probably saw an American movie with the name Sam in it, and that's why he's Samuel. Those laws, which were pretty much like the Jim Crow laws here in the United States, possibly somewhat more severe, took away my father's business. And he was an auto mechanic with a very good reputation, and an electrician of some note. But nevertheless, he ended up being I'll get back to that one, a teacher in a Jewish school where he was teaching boys how to fix cars, how to deal with machinery, whatever. This was in hope that they would be able to go to a new country and earn a living. We, as a family, all lived in a home which essentially was called a Jew house. These were houses, there were about 52, I believe, in Nuremberg. They were not a ghetto, but we were about 4 or 5 families all living in this one house. And sometime in 1939, there was a party where other Jewish children also arrived. I'm the guy in the front holding on to the tricycle. As a matter of fact, that girl and the other boy holding on to the tricycle, we all lived in that house. And none of us were related to the other. In 1941, the war in Europe had been going on for over 2 years. and Germany had really conquered the East, an edict came out that said from Bavaria, and Bavaria is, there we go, is that area down here underneath the Danube, that over 1,000 Jews will be transported to Latvia, which is up here. This is newly conquered territory, and 520 of those Jews came from Nuremberg. Of that number, at the end of the war, there were 17 survivors. My brother, my mother, and myself being among them. There were other transports out of Nuremberg to other places. Most of them had no survivors. Now, that 17 survivors is a little bit of a fudge number, because when those 520 people were sent off, my brother and I, and anybody below the age of 10, was not counted. But as a survivor, we were. We were sent to Latvia, as I said, and the place that we were sent to was a small concentration camp called Jungfernhof, which no one ever really hears about. It was sort of a holding camp. People died, people were killed. But we were there for a short period of time. It may have been a week, it may have been 3 weeks, I don't know. But my family, and I'm sure some other people, were then transferred to the Riga ghetto. And we were in that ghetto in a small apartment with a lot of other people, everybody sleeping on the floor, and you could see, I could see from the window looking out, that the ghetto was being emptied, sort of, because people were being put on trucks and they were going out, and I had a feeling that this was not a good thing. But nevertheless, we were there again for a short period of time. By the way, when I speak of time, remember, I am just about 6 years old, so time, I guess for my whole life, has been a fudgeable thing, but my memory of how long things were, who knows. But we were taken out of that ghetto and put into an apartment house, small apartment house, with some other Jews. Some were Lithuanian or Latvian, some were German, and my father would take those students that were also transported at that time and take them to a garage to fix German army vehicles. The rest of the people in that house would sort clothing that had been taken from people who had been killed into summer, winter, men's, women's, and so on. And that clothing would then be sent back to Germany. Oops, pressed the wrong button. This is more of a situation in terms of where we were. And this is where the Riga was. Oh, sorry, wrong country. up in here. And I want to point out some things about this map. One, you will see red skull and bones. These are all designated for concentration camps whose design was to kill. They may have had the sign Arbeit macht frei, which says work will free you, but they were not work camps. Purpose was to kill. The black skull and crossbones are all places where people were slaughtered in large numbers. And you can certainly look them up. Babi Yar probably being the most famous, which is in the Ukraine, and Rumbula. Rumbula was in Riga. It's the name of woods right outside of the city. And what the Nazis did was, just before that train arrived that we were on, they took 20,000 people out of the ghetto, and they had to be marched for about 7 miles in very cold weather to the woods, where they literally were marched into trenches which had been previously dug and shot. 20,000 people in about 3 days. I would suggest you look up all these names. And if I remember correctly, if you have a pen, you can write it on your hand so you'll remember. Rumbula, Babi Yar, and so on. Other camps also killed people, but their main focus was work, or trying to get them to work until they died. And it changed over the war. And I will get back to some of that. We were in that house for a few months. Then we were transferred right to where the garage was. And again, we were there for a few months. But my father worked with those boys. They fixed cars. Compared to the people in the ghetto, I assume our life was fairly good. My mother cooked for these boys, and this went on until, probably the beginning of 1943. At that point, we get moved up to there. And I know that's the place because my brother told me, which doesn't make probably any more sense than your brother telling you, but nonetheless, it doesn't really matter. But we were there, closer to the front, so those cars could be fixed. We were put in a farmhouse, which is part of a village, and there were no fences. My mother cooked for everyone. There were no guards, not really in the sense that I remember. There were German soldiers, but they were there to protect the vehicles. There were attacks by Russian forces, because I remember waking up to machine gun fire one night. My mother told us afterwards that this was a nightly occurrence, but I only remember it once. And again, it was a relatively good life. The rule was that if any of the boys tried to escape, we, the family, would be killed. Again, I wasn't aware of that. But we were there until, I would say, sometime, maybe late spring of 1943, because at that point, things started to become untenable. While we had been up there, my father, and maybe some of the boys, was taken to a city somewhere in Russia where there had been damage to an electrical facility. And he and the boys were supposed to repair it. While there was an attack of Russian or Soviet forces, and my father saved the life of a German officer. All that being done, they came back and they closed the camp, and we were then sent back. Most of the boys were either killed or died in Kaiserwald, which had been the successor, a concentration camp, which had been the successor of the ghetto. My family, the four of us, were not sent back there. We were sent into the men's civil prison of Riga. It's like any other civil prison in any other country in the world. We were in that one cell, which my mother never left for 3 months. The rest of us were able to walk in the exercise yard I don't know how often, but I remember on more than one occasion walking that yard. My parents tried to entertain my brother and me. Remember, he's 3 years younger than I am. So if I'm 7, he's even smaller and less cooperative. Near the end of 1943, we were transferred from that cell into a cell in the basement or on the first floor, and this is the first time I really sensed fear in my parents. I did not know, I'm sure they had been afraid all this time, but this was the first time I was totally aware of it. What did happen was we were taken out of that cell, it was in the evening, at night, and we were put onto one truck of maybe 3 or 4 other trucks, and we were smuggled back into Germany. And we were smuggled underneath clothing, which was being sent back to Germany. Clothing, probably, which had been processed in that house that we had been living in before. Anytime we came to a border crossing or whatever else, we had to really dig underneath there. We were then taken, and this was a truck ride from here to what I believe was Berlin. So it was more than a day. If you look at another distance between Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen, which is a trip we took later, you can sort of judge distances. So it probably took 4 or 5 days of being on the back of that truck. When we got to this area, which I believe was Berlin, but I'm not totally sure, those soldiers then gave us up to the authorities. And I remember a judge yelling at my parents, and he then said that we, my mother, brother, and I, would go to Ravensbrück over here. I'll talk more about that. And my father would go to Buchenwald. And this is where he died. And he died in May of 1944. We were sent to Ravensbrück, which was the only women's concentration camp. And when we got there in early 1944, it had about 20% Jewish population. The rest were political, deviants, as they were called, any number of pejorative terms for someone other than themselves. It was a camp which was a work camp. Siemens, I think the second largest electrical manufacturing company in the world today, had a building attached to the camp. It also had other factories which made clothing for the military. As a matter of fact, they would take furs that had been taken from people that had been killed and use those furs as lining for officers' coats. That's one of the reasons I believe we were in Berlin, which is relatively about 60 kilometers from Ravensbrück. My mother worked in the fields. I don't know what other work she did. For a little bit of time, she was taking care of kids in the camp. And there were other children there. As I said, camps were used for killing at all times, but Ravensbrück also introduced a gas chamber, and it isn't talked about really because they claim that since there were only 5,000 to 20,000 people killed in that gas chamber, it's not really noted as such. Now, the war was not going well for Germany. So they decided to close Ravensbrück. Now, over all this time, other camps further east of Ravensbrück had been emptied into Ravensbrück. So they then took people from Ravensbrück and emptied the camp. We were sent by cattle car from Ravensbrück to Bergen-Belsen, and Bergen-Belsen should be, come on, where are we? There we go, right over there. And that had started out as a prisoner of war camp, and then transferred into a concentration camp. And as bad as conditions were in Ravensbrück, this was worse. The only thing that prepared us for Bergen-Belsen was that cattle car ride to it, because people were packed into it, we weren't fed or watered, and there were 2 holes in the floor where people could relieve themselves, and some people died. At any rate, we were put into smaller barracks than Ravensbrück, and sleeping on the floor. Getting food was a sometime thing, and certainly water. I remember getting water for my brother and mother, because I think we took turns getting sick. On April 15th, 1945, which I consider my second birthday, we were rescued by the British forces. And this picture, which was really taken in April 16, was part of a film that they took and then showed at the Nuremberg trials, where they tried all of those people. And that's me, and that's my brother. We were, as I said, rescued. The people were in bad shape, and the English, tried to move people out of there as quickly as possible. We were moved to a camp which had been used by the Germans to train their tank soldiers. We were there from rescue, April 45 till September 45, where my mother recovered because she had had a breakdown at the end of this. And we went by truck, American truck, to Nuremberg, where we lived in what had been an old age home for Jewish people before the war, which was very near that Jew house that I had been living in, and therefore I remembered walking to it because I could, at that time, being 5 years old, ride the dumbwaiter up and down, and it was a very positive memory. And we lived in that house for a year. And this is one of the most unusual pictures of World War, of the Holocaust. And it's unusual for who's in it. You have my brother and me, who are still children, and all those old people. They're even old compared to what I think of myself now. These people were all survivors of a concentration camp called Theresienstadt, and that was in Czechoslovakia. And that was the camp that any time the Red Cross wanted to find out about concentration camps, this is where the Germans would take them. They would issue the inmates blankets, which were taken away after the Red Cross left. They would show them all the cultural things that they had. In other words, the good life that was being led in the concentration camps. This was the camp that both my maternal grandparents died in. And they were put in there for the same reason that all these other people were put in there. The men were all heroes of World War I. And this was basically their reward. There are some exceptions. You can see my mother and this man who will marry into the family, my stepfather. He survived by having been deported to Poland before the war because his parents were Polish. He was born in Germany. And when Russia and Germany divided Poland, he happened to be in the Russian section. And when Germany attacked the Russians, he was able to run into Russia, basically join the army, and fight his way back into Germany. And that's how he survived. And he survived by being a mine detector. He literally walked in front of tanks with a stick. Never got really wounded. We then, from this place, went into a displaced person camp in Munich, and then we stayed here for a year. Displaced person camp for a few months, and then to another one in Bremerhaven, which is a port. And we left Bremerhaven in January 1947 and came to New York, where, and I'm going to cut this short so there will be time for a little bit for questions. We were then met by my uncles, my mother's brothers, one of whom had come here in 1933 as a 17-year-old, and the other one who had escaped Germany in 1939, the day before Germany attacked Poland, and he had gotten to England, and since the English didn't know who was the good guy, who was the bad guy, they interned him. And by the way, you should know that concentration camps were invented by the British. He then stayed in there for a while, and they transferred all those people to Canada, and in Canada he was released, and therefore he was able to meet us in 1947. Because of my health was in question, I went with my uncle to Florida, where he lived. My brother stayed with a cousin of my mother's who had come here in the 1920s. And my mother went to work as a live-in maid. When I got to Florida, it was very disturbing. I had, one, never been separated from my mother and brother. Two, it looked so different than anything I had ever seen before. The weather certainly was a factor, because we left New York, it was snow on the ground, and there we've gotten to tropical Florida. The only things familiar were the Shell gasoline sign, which is the same all over the world, and the way Black Americans were treated. It was all too familiar. I then went back, I went to school in the 5th grade, and since I'd never gone to school, and it was in the wrong language, they put me back into 2nd grade. In 2nd grade, I certainly learned English, and I finished up. At the end of that semester, I went to New York to be back with my brother and mother, and my stepfather, because that summer they got married. I then went into the 3rd grade. Halfway through, I got skipped into the 5th grade. At the end of 5th grade, I got skipped into 7th grade, and I supposedly was all caught up, and I wasn't, and I'm still not. At the end of 8th grade, I went to a vocational high school because as I said, I had never really caught up. At the end of that, learning to be a refrigeration mechanic, which I never worked at, I did get into the community college in New York, and it took me 2.5 years to finish that, and then worked for the Navy Yard in Brooklyn as a technician, and fell in love with metalwork, foundry, pouring of metals. And I got myself admitted to the Missouri Schools of Mines and Metallurgy, where I got to be a metallurgical engineer. I came back to New York, met my wife, married. We have 2 children. I worked as an engineer for 10 years and then switched into teaching middle school science for about 30 years. I then retired, and here I am. And I am willing to entertain questions for as long as you can throw them.
Can we have a round of applause, please, for Mr. So, Mr. Stern, and it's certainly a powerful message, I'll ask the first question, and you talked about this during your powerful speech, but what were some of the lessons learned from your experience to share with high school students? What were some of your lessons?
I don't know if lessons learned at that time are that prevalent. I think it's over a lifetime that one learns lessons. I've certainly learned in terms of teaching that, and you can ask your parents, who will probably say, well, you're nothing like your brother, sister, or vice versa. We're all different. And we all have that right to be different. And that's one of the lessons that I have taken.
All right, are there, if you'd like to ask a question, you could raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you. Yes.
So, if any, did you have any experience reading German?
Being different?
Reading German.
Were you able to read German at all?
When we came here, I never went to school in Germany. Or, not true, I went for a few weeks, I think, in Nuremberg, but emotionally I could not take it. So I did not go to school until Florida. My parents decided that the language we would speak in our family would be English, so we did not speak German, or very little of it. So whatever German I have is the German of a 10-year-old boy.
Hi. How much did this affect you for like the rest of your life? Like how often, day to day, does this?
Could you repeat that? I could not hear.
How much does this like affect your day to day life?
Well, I try to curtail my talks to 1 a week so it doesn't affect me Other than that, I don't know if it does. I mean, cumulatively, my life ended up being what it is. My brother, who started his education at a more appropriate time, he went on to get a PhD in biology and work as a professor all of his life. So who knows, if I might have done that, but I might have missed out on 30 years of middle school.
Did the anti-Semitism in Germany come all at once, or was it more of a gradual thing that happened over time?
I would be answering that question based on what I've read, not on what I experienced. The only 2 times that I felt, quote, this anti-Semitism, and I gave your principal a write-up that I did, was one, walking with my father and having little kids throw rocks at us, which didn't make any sense to me at all. And 2, before we went away, my parents had my tonsils taken out. I don't know if it was preventative or I actually needed it, but I had to literally sneak into the doctor's office.
Hi, Mr. Stern. As a kid and up to now, did you have any pets? Like, you know, cats, dogs?
I did have a cat, and there's a picture of it with me holding that cat. I don't know if that was my cat or the house cat or just a neighborhood cat, but I'm holding on to that cat. And by the way, many of the pictures, you see, are pictures that were given to friends of my parents and then given back when we came back. We certainly did not take, my parents did not take them with us to the camps.
Did you get like a number tattooed on you? Because I know some people got tattooed with the numbers and they were designated as a number, not a name.
Would you repeat that, please?
Did you get like a number tattooed on you? Because I know some people were designated, they were like called numbers and not names.
No, the numbers were given in the death camps, not in every camp. And they were generally not given to the children because I said children did not survive. You have another one over here.
If you ever had like toys or play with anything as a kid, what would you normally play with or use as toys?
I did not get that. Would you repeat?
As a growing up, what toys would you play as a young man? What toys did you play with? You know,
I still don't get it. I must be losing my hearing.
The question is if, look, what toys did you play with growing up?
Certainly didn't have any toys in the internment that I remember. The only toy that I do remember was a toy that that girl on the tricycle had and that I discovered among those piles of clothing that were supposed to be sorted. And at that age, I knew what that meant.
Okay, we're going to have one final question, and then we're going to have our closing comments from the rabbi. There you go.
Apart from your education, how did your heritage and experience impact you and your life growing up in America after you left?
I think what I want to get to is the question that I started off with. Why do we talk to people like you? And as I did many times in my teaching, I gave the answers. All you had to do was listen. And the answer is, we want among everyone, to get to the word of empathy. And you have to be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. You have to be aware of who they are and what they are. And to a degree, it shouldn't matter where they are. I heard a newscast early this week, which hardly got any play on any of the news media, that in Tunisia, the president of Tunisia, who is questioning his ability to stay in power, decided to pick on the black citizens of his country. And by arbitrary law, he just established some of these same things that were established there. And we have to think about those people, because as I keep emphasizing, one, I'm going to mention the fact that you don't know our history. And one of the things that you should study more is, and I'm not trying to be funny now, are the cartoons that appear in our papers. And at one point there was a character named Pogo. And I'm willing to bet not many people in here know who Pogo was. Yet Pogo was put up to be run as president. There was a movement, Pogo for president. Pogo was a cartoon character who lived in the Okefenokee swamp. And he took on major political issues. And one of them was the environment. This is now in the 50s. And this cartoon, what I'm about to show you, has gotten to be famous. And it's got something for all of us to remember, and I think it's the answer to your question. And that's this.
Thank you, Mr. Stern. Rabbi Handler will offer closing comments. And students, if you have additional questions, Mr. Stern will be here after our assembly. So, Rabbi?
Mr. Stern, thank you so much for sharing your story, and happy second birthday.
Thank you.
When you hear a fact like 11 million people were murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust, 6 million of them Jews, these numbers seem so large that they're hard to truly comprehend. When I was in high school, I was privileged to hear stories from dozens of Holocaust survivors. Each one was completely different, and the story I heard today was like nothing I've ever heard. Some survived by hiding or being raised by Christian families. Some were prisoners in concentration camps or extermination camps, and somehow managed to stay alive, one seeming miracle after another, until they were eventually liberated. Each story represented a family, a whole world that was forever changed because of this atrocity. A family's story made possible by each one of these survivors so that they created new families to live on. But then you stop to think about the 11 million people that didn't make it, and all these stories lost. When I was your age, I cannot understand how this could have happened. It seemed unfathomable. And to be honest, I still can't. In an attempt to understand, I went with a group of teens from all over the world to Poland on a program called March of the Living. We bore witness to this horror. We saw the places where Jewish towns once stood before everyone had been rounded up and murdered. We saw several concentration camps. And as I walked up and back, inside and between these bunkers, seeing the gas chambers and the mass graves, I was in disbelief. I had always imagined that these camps must have all been really far away from towns. And maybe there were a lot of regular folks, citizens who just didn't know the extent to what was happening around them and to everything that Hitler was doing. But after being there, I realized how many of these camps were centrally located. Some of the camps were no further from town, no further from Center City than we are today. Every year on Yom HaShoah, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, we light candles to remember the lives that were lost, to remember the individuals, the towns, the groups of people who were targeted by the Nazis for extermination. And we pray that something like this might never happen again. Never forget is what we say. Never forget every precious story of those who survived and those who were lost. Never forget that 11 million Jews, Roma, LGBTQ+ people, disabled people, and others labeled as undesirable in some way were rounded up by their government and murdered simply for existing. Never forget that this mass extermination did not happen overnight. It happened little by little, with rights slowly being taken away, as we heard, with small acts of discrimination, of oppression, of violence, and of hatred. Never forget how hatred and fear can spread and swell when they're left unchecked. Never forget that it is up to us, all of us, to make sure that an atrocity like the Holocaust never happens again. Never forget that it was because of people like us that some were saved. They were saved to tell their stories, to build their families, and to help us live in a better society, to make better choices. And it was also because of people like us who did too little that so many were not. Never forget. May our world soon be devoid of hatred, filled instead with peace. And may the story that you heard today inspire all of us to both stand up for ourselves and for others, to stop hatred in its tracks so that it never has a chance to take root or to erupt, so that we can approach our differences with curiosity and an open heart, rather than with judgment and fear, so that the only thing that we are gifting to our future generations is kindness and respect. Thank you.
And thank you. Before I thank you, Rabbi Handler and Mr. Stern, and thank you to the students. You guys rock it all the time, and I appreciate your focus and your engagement hearing such a powerful story. Mr. Stern will remain for pictures and any questions that you have, and we have an official Spartan hat here, so you are now officially a Spartan. So if I could give you a hat, and thank you.
It's a nice hat.
If you could put it on, there you go. So one more round of applause, please.